Hello, lovely podcast people. I hope you're well. This is, I guess, what would be called a pilot podcast or a preliminary podcast or a primer podcast. I don't know. It's a fairly off-the-cuff podcast. I just recorded an episode on what would you do if you had 1 hour a day, resistance training or walking for fat loss. And it reminded me of some studies around walking and the impact it has on individuals with regards to their NEAT and how some people stop moving as much in the other. Let's say you're walking around for an hour a day and you're asleep for 7 hours. The other 16 hours that you have in your day, you move around less. Some individuals, some people, it doesn't happen as much. Some people, it barely happens at all. Some people, that extra movement just leads to greater energy expenditure over the day. Those people are blessed, I guess is the word. And it just made me think of, it's just another instance of where we have these so between you and your friend, individual variances in our responses to food, in our responses to exercise. And so it's a super alluring topic. I did my dissertation for my undergraduate degree on genetic differences on what's called the angiotensin converting enzyme polymorphism between different individuals and their habitual strength levels. So I was super interested in this area. And then I did my master's research on food intolerance testing, the difference between different individuals and their IgG immunoglobulin G responses to different foods and the levels of those immunoglobulins in their blood to a whole panel of 50 plus different foods in athletic population. I don't know if you're watching, again, as I mentioned in one of my previous episodes on Spotify, you can now watch on videos. Over there over my right shoulder is such a test that, for legal reasons, I would say allegedly, is complete and utter BS. So it's an alluring subject. I am totally on board with the fact that it is super duper interesting, and I will be the first to shout from the rooftops when we can use it. However, to this day, there are just these DNA tests, these microbiome tests, these glucose response tests are absolute rubbish. Now, first and foremost, there are instances where we can test stuff. We can test someone's genetics and we can say that someone has certain genes. The problem is almost categorically, with regards to nutrition, we don't know what those genes mean. We can say they might increase the likelihood, like we have the FTO gene, which means you are likely to have a higher BMI. You are likely to have a higher appetite. But what good does that do you? Because it doesn't tell you, I called out a certain other, original gangster, OG of the nutrition evidence-based research world on this, because he was going around saying, if you're a female and based on your menstrual cycle, during certain phases of your menstrual cycle, your appetite goes up, and during this time we should increase protein intake if you're trying to get fat loss. But the problem is that if someone's trying to lose fat, we will try to help them with their appetite with an elevated protein intake. And there is nothing to say, let's say we've elevated it to this industry standard of 2 grams per kilogram, then okay, during this week you're a bit more hungry, let's increase it further. Like, you can't just keep increasing and if we could, we'll increase it until that individual has maximally got their appetite under control, and any more protein doesn't seem to do anything. We want to keep their dietary variety and XYZ. So you've got no extra leverage in that week. You just need to probably go, as I talked about on my tour, to thousands of people. It's just increase your calories in that week. Just take a step back, reduce the speed of progress by 25% that week, going back to maintenance. Simples. And lots of other people have now taken that message and run with it and pretend that it's their own, but whatever. So going back to this whole thing of like personalized nutrition, these people are sadly just sellouts. Tim Spector, a few times I've shied away from saying his name, but at least a year or more ago, I said on air, I think it was on a guest podcast or somewhere, I need to find it out so I can be like, I spotted it first. I knew he was going to sell out. I knew he was the next Tim Noakes. He's a professor who just maybe has got money hungry or I don't know, like Tim Noakes, I have actually got a bit of, is the word empathy, but understanding, sympathy. He had a personal revelation and his personal experience sent him off he went full potato and just forgot how to do science. But Tim Spector, I don't really know that he's had that instance. I think he's just money or fame hungry, or he's just a numpty. Like, he's a very intelligent man in his very specific, he's very knowledgeable in a very specific area, but he's then, or it's, what's the other word? What's the other phrase? What's the other? Savior syndrome or something? He thinks he's got all the answers. I don't know, but basically he's gone from having a very specific knowledge and then trying to apply it to a broad range of subjects of fat loss, which he doesn't have any particular specialism. He's never, as I understand, been a practitioner. He's never worked with hundreds of clients helping them. He's never studied nutrition in a broader realm, done dietetics, nutrition or anything like that. But all of a sudden he's telling people how to personalize their nutrition, and with basically a complete lack of understanding around energy balance. But is also making such silly absolutist claims in the media that I just believe he's selling out. He wants money. He's got a huge vested interest in biotechnologies. And I'm going to do a better podcast than this where I talk to you more about some of the studies that have been done, what they really showed. And it's a very similar story to the genetics studies and people going away and getting their DNA tested. And then, you've got these genes and therefore you should eat a little bit like this. And it always just ends up just going, eat less highly refined foods and eat more of these whole foods. And realistically, all of this blood glucose monitoring, all of this microbiome testing always comes back to this thing of like, nothing is actually being personalized. Even this is another one of my things, is like Tim Spector is very much, again, similar to Tim Noakes in the low carb crowd, in that there's a bit of an obsession around blood glucose, when there's nothing wrong with your blood glucose going up. If there was, we've got so much research on low carb versus low fat. In the low carb diet groups or low carb maintenance groups or low carb health groups, you get so much greater glucose excursions. There is so much greater area under the blood glucose curve because you are eating glucose in the form of any carbohydrates, whether they're whole grain or whether they're processed or ultra processed, whatever. And in the low carb groups, you're simply not eating carbohydrate. Therefore, you don't have big peaks and troughs of glucose. But there's no greater benefit for fat loss. There's no greater benefit for health. Basically keto would be the world's healthiest diet if glucose was bad for us. But yet we've got plenty of, like, Bueno et al. Is it Bueno et al? No, Bueno et al. Just shows us that, a year of going absolutely keto, low carb, whatever, plus or minus about 1 kilogram, the difference in your body weight with people just eating a, pretty standard, crappy, not even high protein, low fat, whatever, typical standard dietary guidelines type diet. But we've got the, MAPI diets, which is fairly macrobiotic, which vegan-esque diets. We've got some of Kevin Hall's studies on, I believe it was purely vegetarian, I think it was, versus I think ketogenic diets, at least very low carb, I believe it was, yeah. And, greater fat loss in the low fat, high carb diets and greater reduction in appetite or self-chosen, ad libitum eating calorie intake. Just this idea that if you do this thing, if you add apple cider vinegar to a meal or a food like this glucose goddess GIMP, GGG, glucose goddess GIMP. Wow. There you go. Hammered it. Nailed it. Lots of you have messaged me about her. Again, her and Tim Spector and any of these other, there's a big kind of massive circle jerk, although can you be in a circle jerk if you're a woman? I guess. I don't know. It's just a term, you know what I mean? I've got this visual. But she's part of the circle jerk of just, personalized nutrition, glucose excursions, area under the curve, glucose. Or if you have, what was one I saw recently? It was ridiculous. It was like spinach versus Nutella. And then she'd done her blood glucose response, and it was like, see, if you spread spinach on your rye bread, there's less glucose than Nutella. It was it wasn't that, for me maintaining my integrity, it wasn't that, but it was literally like butter. Again, I'm exaggerating, but it was literally something that had virtually no carbohydrate in it versus something that was a hugely carbohydrate based snack or meal or food. And it was like, look at the difference in the glucose curve. It's like, well, obviously GIMP. You can go find it, whatever. Anyway, lots of you have been messaging me about her. She's of the same ilk as Tim et al. Glucose isn't bad. We know there's certain foods we probably should eat less of. It's those ultra processed foods. But a food that happens to release its glucose at a different speed to another one doesn't, or has higher, more or less glucose doesn't make a difference. And suddenly adding apple cider vinegar, so it changes the way you break down that food. It doesn't. We look at endpoints. On Mac Nutrition Uni, we talk about endpoints. Like someone's appetite might change in an acute period of measurement in the study, in a fat loss depending on diets. But if at the end of the study they haven't lost different amounts of fat, or someone's metabolism might change in a different way, but their metabolism might slow down more, but their appetite might reduce more, which is actually something we do see, which is something I definitely want to do a little, because I talk about this often and I want to do a short, succinct, very explanatory podcast on this, which is about energy flux and appetite and the drivers of appetite, because I think it'd be helpful for people to understand. Anyway, so we talk about these endpoints, oh, look at the glucose, the difference here. It's like, we don't know that there's any benefit to that. Like, we need to wait until we know if there's a benefit, because right now we definitely do not know. And you might think, oh, that'll spike your blood glucose. It's like, that's not a bad thing. That's just a completely normal response to eating foods that we have been eating for thousands and millions of years. I'm not a historian. I'm not a paleontologist. Anyway, you get my point. Paleontologist probably not that's what Ross is in Friends, right? I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but essentially since the dawn of man, we've been eating foods that contain carbohydrate, right? And they release blood glucose, and we have effective systems for managing once we eat them to increase the oxidation of it and the storage of it. And these morons saying that we need to personalize, like, you're not going to personalize based on every single food you eat. And even then, if you do personalize, you don't know what you're personalizing based on, because we don't have the endpoints. We just go, oh, you seem to release glucose differently to that person, but actually you release it differently today to how you did yesterday, or based on the food that you ate, or the fact that you did a walk today, or the studies on postprandial lipemia, which is like you do a walk yesterday and it changes your response to food today. Like Professor David Stencil, one of my amazing professors, that was doing the studies in the 90s. Anyway, cool. So that was just more of a little rant, an introduction. I feel like I owe it to lots of you, because you've been sending so many messages about this junk science and people wearing these continuous blood glucose monitors in some kind of crazy aim to optimize their nutrition. It's silly. And I'll do a better podcast with references and that's planned. This one was just off the cuff of my last podcast. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. I quite enjoyed it. And until next time, much love. I'm going to watch Big Hero 6 with my children now.